My name is Kiva Bailey, and I was 34 the day my older brother laughed at me in a mahogany-lined law office. We were there for the reading of my grandfather's will. The attorney cleared his throat, looked at me with pity, and said I had inherited a 1978 Ford pickup truck. The room erupted. Brent leaned back in his leather chair grinning and said it loud enough for the assistants in the hall to hear. "Good luck with that junk, Kiva. I'll lend you $100 for the scrap fee." I did not argue. I smiled, picked up the rusted keys they slid across the polished wood, and walked out. What none of them understood was that the metal keychain had a specific sequence of numbers etched into the back. My grandfather never left anything to chance. 48 hours later, I knew exactly why Brent wanted that truck destroyed. Welcome back to Pan of Vengeance, where the people who get handed the scraps end up owning the table. How old are you? And have you ever had a family member try to take what is rightfully yours? Drop your age in the comments and be sure to subscribe. I live in coastal Maine and work as a logistics coordinator for a regional shipping firm. I track maritime freight managed supply chains and spot anomalies in data. I like order. I like systems that balance out. My brother Brent likes noise. He is a local real estate flipper wearing tailored wool coats and a smile that never reaches his eyes. The office belonged to Mr. Sterling, who had handled the Bailey family trusts for decades. He shifted the heavy parchment papers like they burned his fingers. Brent sat near the window, acting like a man who already owned the building. My mother Susan sat next to him, twisting her wedding ring. When Sterling read the distribution, Brent received the coastal properties, the investment portfolios, and the business assets. Then Sterling reached my name. To Kiva, I leave the 1978 Ford. The sharp bark of laughter from Brent cut through the dry heat of the room. My mother looked down at her lap. I held the keys. The metal was cold, heavy, and distinctly engraved. Grandpa Henry had spent my childhood teaching me how engines worked. A good engine runs quiet, he used to tell me, wiping oil from his hands. A bad engine makes a lot of racket right before it throws a rod. Brent was making a lot of racket. The morning after the will reading, I drove out to Grandpa's property to retrieve the Ford. A commercial tow truck was already backed into the driveway. The hydraulic winch whined a high-pitched squeal that echoed off the wet pines. Brent stood on the wraparound porch holding a ceramic coffee mug. "Just doing you a favor, Kev," he called out, "sending it to the crusher. You do not have anywhere to park this eyesore anyway." It made no sense. Why pay a premium commercial tow fee for worthless scrap? I stepped directly between the rusted chrome bumper and the driver's rig. I pulled out my phone, wiped the coastal mist from the screen, and pulled up Title 29A of the Maine Revised Statutes. The driver paused, holding a length of heavy iron chain. I looked him in the eye. "The estate has not cleared probate. If you hook that axle, you are committing grand theft auto under state law. I will file the report before your tires hit the highway." The driver stared at my screen, then dropped the chains. They hit the gravel with a heavy clank. He climbed back into his cab and shifted into gear. Brent squeezed the porch railing until his knuckles turned white. His fake smile vanished, replaced by raw panic. I climbed into the cab of the Ford. The interior smelled of old tobacco and cedar. The dashboard was gutted, but the radio dial remained uniquely modified with heavy clicking notches. I cranked the sputtering engine and drove it off the property. In my rearview mirror, Brent was furiously dialing his phone. The truck was not junk. It was a vault, and Brent was terrified of what I might find inside. The steering wheel vibrated against my palms as I steered the Ford down the coastal highway. The engine knocked with a rhythmic, metallic thud. Every time I pressed the accelerator, the transmission hesitated before catching. It was a dying machine. But inside the cab, my mind was running through a flowchart of Brent's behavior. In logistics, we look for choke points. A choke point is where the normal flow of operations backs up because something in the system is failing. Brent paying a rush fee to scrap a vehicle he did not own was a glaring choke point. He inherited millions in prime coastal real estate. He had investment portfolios and cash accounts. Why care about a rusted pickup truck worth a few $100s in scrap metal? People with nothing to hide do not rush. I ran my thumb over the worn dashboard. The vinyl was cracked from decades of sun exposure. The radio was a hollowed-out cavity of wires, but the tuning dial remained intact. I reached out and turned it. Click, click. Heavy, deliberate notches, not smooth like a standard tuner. My grandfather was a man who engineered solutions. If he left a broken radio dial with reinforced gears, he did it for a reason. I filed the mechanical, tactile memory away. The truck was a perfect representation of how my family viewed me. I was the reliable workhorse, the one who handled the unglamorous tasks, while Brent took the spotlight. When our grandmother fell ill 10 years ago, I was the one who managed her medication schedules, organized her transport, and balanced the care accounts. Brent showed up for holiday dinners in designer suits and took the credit for being a supportive grandson. My mother, Susan, facilitated this dynamic. She treated Brent like a fragile investment that needed constant protection, while I was treated like the foundation, expected to bear the weight and remain invisible. They thought I would take the keys to this rusted shell and fade into the background. They miscalculated. I checked the side mirror to merge onto Interstate 295 heading toward Portland. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle, leaving a greasy sheen on the asphalt. 3 car lengths back, a sleek, dark-tinted SUV merged directly behind me. I recognized the grille profile. It was a high-end import, the exact model driven by Jessica, my brother's wife, and her real estate associates. I maintained my speed at 55 miles per hour. The SUV stayed locked in my slipstream. When I switched to the passing lane, the dark vehicle matched the movement. This was the next layer of conflict. Brent was not just annoyed by my refusal to scrap the truck, he was actively tracking its location. If this was just about pride, he would have gone back into his warm house and poured another coffee. Stalking an inherited vehicle in the rain meant he was protecting a vulnerability. In supply chain management, you learn how to route around blockages. You learn the topography of your environment. The driver of the SUV was likely expecting me to head straight to my apartment complex in the city center. Instead, I took the industrial exit toward the shipyard district. This area was my territory. It is a labyrinth of freight terminals, chain-link fences, and loading docks. The roads here are narrow, flanked by stacked shipping containers and heavy machinery. I steered the sputtering Ford down a service alley behind a seafood processing plant. The SUV followed, but hesitated at the uneven pothole-scarred pavement. I downshifted, forcing the old transmission to grab a lower gear, and took a sharp right turn into a commercial loading bay. A fleet of delivery box trucks was currently backing out for their afternoon routes. I slipped the Ford right between 2 departing delivery trucks, essentially using a moving wall of commercial steel to block the narrow alleyway behind me. I watched the rearview mirror. The dark SUV was trapped behind the reversing delivery fleet, unable to move forward or back out quickly. The tail was severed. I navigated the remaining miles through the back streets until I reached the outskirts of the industrial park. Tucked between a specialized welding fabricator and a defunct lumber yard was an auto garage. The faded painted sign read, "Dave's Auto and Diesel." Dave was a seasoned veteran of the trade. He had thick, calloused hands and a permanent smudge of motor oil etched into the lines of his face. He had maintained Grandpa Henry's vehicle since the early 90s. He operated on a cash basis and did not ask unnecessary questions. I pulled the Ford into the gravel lot and cut the ignition. The engine shuddered and died with a final metallic gasp. Dave walked out of the open garage bay, wiping his hands on a shop rag. He looked at the rusted panels, the sagging suspension, and the mismatched tires. He shook his head slowly. I stepped out of the cab, pulling my jacket tight against the coastal wind. "She is rough, Keva," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "I did not think Henry kept this old girl around. I thought he sold it years ago." I handed in the keys. The metal keychain clinked against his grease-stained palm. "I need you to look at the block, Dave. My brother tried to tow it to the crusher this morning. He was very eager to see it destroyed." Dave narrowed his eyes. The mention of the crusher shifted his demeanor. He looked from the keys to my face, and then back to the rusted hood of the truck. A seasoned mechanic knows when a machine holds a story. I stood under the corrugated tin awning of the garage while the rain started to pick up again. I thought about the financial ledgers Brent managed for the family business. As a logistics coordinator, I deal with balance sheets, supply chains, and inventory logs daily. If a shipping manifest claims a container holds 50 tons of textiles, but the crane strain gauge registers 80 tons, you have a critical discrepancy. Brent was a walking discrepancy. For the last 3 years, he had been living far beyond the logical means of a regional real estate flipper. He drove imported luxury sedans that cost more than a standard commercial mortgage. He took his wife on lavish European vacations every winter. My mother, Susan, constantly praised his outward success at every family gathering, acting as his personal public relations manager. She treated him like royalty. But success in real estate requires vast amounts of liquid capital. Brent always seemed frantic behind the eyes when market fluctuations occurred. A truly wealthy, secure man does not panic over a scrap vehicle being driven away by his sister. A leveraged man panics. An overextended, desperate man pays a tow truck driver to commit a felony in broad daylight. The black SUV incident confirmed my hypothesis. People do not deploy surveillance tactics over sentimental disagreements. They deploy surveillance when an asset threatens their survival. By shaking the tail in the industrial district, I had taken away his primary advantage, which was control of the board. He thought I was a predictable piece on his chess set, a reliable, overlooked sister who would park the truck at her apartment and go to work the next day, allowing him to quietly hire someone to steal it in the dead of night. By bringing it directly to Dave, I broke his timeline. Dave circled the vehicle. He ran his hand along the rusted wheel well. The corrosion here is superficial, he noted, tapping the quarter panel, but the suspension is sitting heavy on the front passenger side. Henry always kept his struts balanced. Something is throwing off the weight distribution. He leaned closer to the grill, inspecting the latch mechanism. I watched him work, feeling the cold, damp air seep through my wool coat. The Ford was not just a means of transportation. It was a puzzle box rolling on 4 tires. I remembered the numbers etched into the back of the keychain. I pulled the keys from Dave's hand for a moment and ran my thumb over the digits. 4 numbers. Not a sequence for a standard ignition lock, not a serial number for a dealership replacement. It was a combination. I handed the keys back to Dave. "Pop the hood," I told him. "Let us see what is throwing off the weight." Dave nodded and reached through the missing grill slats to trigger the release lever. The hinges groaned, fighting against years of accumulated grit and neglect. The metal resisted. It took a firm, upward shove from his shoulder to break the seal. The heavy hood creaked open, revealing the dark, greasy cavity of the engine bay. The smell of old antifreeze and scorched rubber drifted into the cold air. Dave grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight from his workbench and clicked it on. The harsh white beam cut through the shadows, illuminating the worn belts, the grimy alternator, and the rust-coated air intake manifold. I stood beside him, bracing myself for whatever secret Grandpa Henry had deemed important enough to leave me instead of cash. Dave leaned over the radiator, bracing his left hand against the frame. He shined the light down toward the firewall near the secondary battery tray. He did not say a word. He just stopped moving. The silence in the garage became profound. The only sound was the steady drumming of the coastal rain hitting the tin roof above us. Dave was a man who had seen every type of mechanical failure imaginable. He had pulled shattered pistons from diesel blocks and rebuilt transmissions that had been torn apart by sheer friction. Nothing under a hood should surprise a man with 30 years of grease under his fingernails. Yet he was frozen, like a statue carved from stone. The flashlight beam in his hand remained perfectly still focused on a specific point deep inside the engine bay. I stepped closer, my boots crunching softly on the concrete floor scattered with absorbent clay dust. "Dave," I said, keeping my tone even, "what do you see?" He did not answer immediately. The air in the garage felt thicker, suddenly heavy with unspoken implications. He slowly lowered the flashlight, turning his head to look at me. The lines around his eyes were drawn tight. The casual, friendly demeanor of a neighborhood mechanic was gone, replaced by a stark, serious intensity. He reached out and wiped a thick layer of grease away from a metal housing bolted near the firewall. "Kiva," he whispered, his voice lacking its usual resonance. "You need to come look at this right now." I moved past the rusted bumper and leaned over the engine block. My logistics training had prepared me for discrepancies. I expected to find a hidden compartment, perhaps a taped envelope stuffed behind the air filter, or a false panel near the glove box. I expected a clue. I did not expect what the harsh white light revealed, resting in the shadows of the engine bay. The tension in my chest tightened into a hard knot. The standoff with the tow truck, the pursuit by the dark SUV, the fake smile on my brother's face. It all aligned in a sudden, chilling sequence. The conflict had just shifted from a petty family dispute over an old truck to something far more dangerous. I leaned over the rusted front quarter panel of the Ford, placing my hands on the cold metal. The harsh white beam of the flashlight cut through the gloom of the engine bay. Dave held the lights steady. Dust motes danced in the illuminated air above the greasy components. I followed the direction of the beam, down past the frayed serpentine belts and the corroded air intake manifold. Tucked deep against the firewall, sitting exactly where a secondary heavy-duty battery should have been installed, was a matte black steel cube. It was covered in a thin layer of road grime and engine oil, blending perfectly into the surrounding mechanical clutter. But underneath the superficial dirt, the edges of the box were sharp and precise. I traced my fingers over the top edge, feeling the unmistakable ridge of a customized titanium alloy. I looked closer at the base where the cube met the steel frame of the truck. The mounting brackets were not fastened with standard factory bolts. They were secured with pristine, immaculate weld lines. The beads of melted metal were layered in perfect overlapping scales. "That is a tungsten inert gas weld," I said, keeping my voice low. "Factory production lines do not use that level of specialized fabrication on a standard pickup truck. That is custom work." Dave exhaled slowly. His breath formed a faint cloud in the damp garage air. He reached out and tapped the top of the steel cube with a grease-stained knuckle. The metal produced a dull, dense thud, indicating significant thickness. "Henry came to me 5 years ago," Dave said, his voice strained, with the weight of a long-held secret. "He drove this old girl into the shop late on a Sunday night, long after I had locked the bays. He brought this box wrapped in a heavy moving blanket. He paid me in cash to fabricate a false battery housing and weld it directly to the firewall. He watched me do the work, stood right where you are standing now, drinking a thermos of black coffee until the metal cooled." I stared at the black cube. My grandfather built his contracting business from nothing. He understood structural integrity, and he understood people. He always knew Brent cared more about the polish on a pair of shoes than the foundation of the floor he walked on. Henry was a man of intense, methodical preparation. If he went to the trouble of installing a fireproof vault inside a decaying vehicle, he was guarding something that could destroy everything else. "What did he tell you?" I asked, turning my gaze to the veteran mechanic. Dave lowered the flashlight. The shadows crept back up the sides of the engine block. "He told me that one day someone would bring this truck into my shop for scrap. He said if it was Brent or that fancy wife of his, I was to put the entire vehicle into the hydraulic crusher and flatten it into a cube of scrap iron with this box still inside. He made me swear on my tools, Kiva. But he also said if you were the one who drove it through those bay doors, I was to pop the hood and step back." My chest tightened. The standoff in the rain, the rush tow order, the dark vehicle tailing me down the coastal highway, it was all orchestrated around this singular piece of hidden hardware. Brent must have known Henry kept private records. He probably searched the coastal properties, tore apart the home office, and found nothing. The only asset left unchecked was the truck. I leaned back over the engine bay and wiped the remaining grease from the front face of the lockbox. Hidden behind a sliding metal plate was a rotary combination dial. It was constructed of high-grade stainless steel, similar to the mechanisms used on commercial-grade floor safes. There was no keyhole. There was no digital keypad. It required a specific numeric sequence to disengage the internal locking tumblers. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the rusted keychain. The 4 digits etched into the back of the metal tag gleamed under the garage lights. I took a steady breath and gripped the steel rotary dial. I spun it clockwise to clear the chambers, then carefully dialed the first number etched on the key. I reversed direction for the second digit, matching the sequence perfectly. I input the third and fourth numbers, then pulled firmly on the heavy latch. The metal handle did not budge. The locking mechanism remained sealed tight. I frowned. I reset the dial and entered the sequence a second time, slowing my movements to ensure exact precision. I pulled the handle again. Nothing happened. The box was a fortress. Dave watched me wiping his hands on his shop rag. Maybe the internal tumblers are seized, he suggested. 5 years sitting next to a hot engine block, dealing with Maine winters and coastal humidity. Metal warps, gears jam. I shook my head. In maritime shipping, when a security container fails to open with the assigned manifest code, you do not blame the lock. You re-examine the manifest. Henry was an engineer of systems. He would not rely on a single point of failure. If the numbers on the key were not the combination, they were a misdirection, a decoy meant to frustrate anyone who managed to steal the keys. A lock without a clear code requires a cipher. I stepped away from the engine bay and walked to the driver's side door of the truck. I pulled the heavy handle, and the door creaked open. I climbed up into the cracked vinyl seat and closed the door, shutting out the ambient noise of the garage. The air inside the cab was stale. I looked at the dashboard. The instrument panel was stripped. The radio was a hollowed-out cavity of loose wires and dead fuses. But the tuning knob remained stubbornly intact on the left side of the stereo housing. I reached out and gripped the plastic knob. I closed my eyes, eliminating visual distractions, to focus entirely on tactile and auditory feedback. I turned the knob to the right. Click. The sound was sharp and heavy. It required deliberate force to turn the gear. I continued turning to the right, counting the precise mechanical notches. 2, 3, 4, 5. The dial hit a hard stop. It would not turn any further to the right. I rotated the knob back to the left. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Another hard stop. I reversed direction again, turning right. 3 clicks. I reversed to the left. 2 clicks. 5, 7, 3, 2. The numbers on the keychain were a distraction. The broken radio dial was the true map. Grandpa Henry had engineered a physical cipher directly into the cab of the truck. You could not open the vault unless you sat in the driver's seat and listened to the machine. I opened my eyes and slid out of the cab. I walked back to the front of the truck, where Dave was waiting patiently in the glow of the flashlight. I reached down to the stainless steel rotary dial on the lockbox. I cleared the tumblers. I turned the dial clockwise to the number 5. I reversed to the left, stopping at 7. I spun right to 3. I turned left to 2. I wrapped my fingers around the heavy latch and pulled. A loud, satisfying metallic clack echoed in the engine bay. The internal steel bolts retracted, and the heavy door of the vault popped open. Dave let out a low whistle of appreciation. Henry was a crafty old ghost, he muttered. I reached inside the dark cavity of the lockbox. The interior was lined with a thermal protective foam. Resting at the bottom was a thick, leather-bound ledger. The cover was worn smooth from years of handling. Beneath the ledger sat a heavy, waterproof document sleeve, sealed tightly at the seams. I pulled both items out and rested them on the edge of the quarter panel. The ledger was heavy in my hands. I opened the thick leather cover. The pages were filled with Grandpa Henry's precise, cramped handwriting. Columns of dates, routing numbers, and financial transactions lined every page. It was a flawless chronological map of his estate. I traced my finger down the final column on the first page. Beside a massive withdrawal of capital was a notation. The initials matched my brother. Beside the initials was a corporate tax identification number I did not recognize. I flipped to the middle of the book. More withdrawals, more corresponding corporate tax numbers. But as I scanned the dates, a chilling pattern emerged. The flow of money was not an artifact of the past. The ledger documented a continuous, systemic drain of capital spanning 4 years, leading right up to the month Henry grew too sick to write. This was not a record of a few bad loans. This was a blueprint of active, ongoing financial fraud. I picked up the waterproof sleeve. Through the translucent plastic, I could see the distinct watermark of an offshore banking institution. I saw the bold printed words, bearer bond. These were untraceable physical assets, the kind of liquid capital a desperate man needs to flee a collapsing empire or pay off dangerous creditors. I closed the ledger and placed it along with the sleeve into my leather messenger bag. The pieces of the puzzle were locking into place, but the image they formed was terrifying. Brent was not just an arrogant real estate flipper. He was a thief drowning in hidden debt. The fake smile, the rush tow order, the frantic phone calls. He needed this ledger destroyed, and he needed these bonds to survive. Dave watched me shoulder the bag. "You found what you were looking for, Kiva?" he asked. I looked down at the dark, wet asphalt of the garage floor. "I found the cargo," I replied, my voice cold and steady. "But the manifest is forged." The conflict had fundamentally changed. I was holding the evidence required to dismantle my brother's entire life. But holding the evidence meant I was now the target. If Jessica was tracking my movements in that dark SUV, she would soon realize the truck was parked at this garage. They would not wait for a legal proceeding. They would try to intercept the documents before I could decode the depths of the fraud. I needed a secure location to process the data, and I needed to act before the next attack arrived at my front door. I left Dave's garage under the cover of early evening darkness. The Maine coastal fog rolled off the harbor thick and gray, clinging to the streetlights like wet cotton. I kept my eyes scanning the rearview mirror, tracking the headlights of every vehicle that turned onto my route. My messenger bag sat heavy on the passenger seat, anchoring me to the reality of the situation. I took a winding, unpredictable path back to my apartment complex in the center of Portland. No dark SUVs followed me this time. I had severed their line of sight at the shipyard. But I knew the reprieve was temporary. I stepped into my apartment and immediately engaged the deadbolt. I slid the heavy brass security chain into its track. I walked through the living room, drawing the heavy blackout curtains over the windows, shutting out the damp city night. I needed an isolated, sterile environment. I cleared my dining table, pushing aside utility bills and empty coffee mugs. I laid the leather-bound ledger and the sealed waterproof sleeve flat against the dark mahogany wood. I switched on the overhead pendant light, casting a bright, focused beam across the documents. When you spend your professional life as a maritime logistics coordinator, you construct a specific mental architecture. You learn to interpret the world through variables, timelines, and cargo weight distributions. You realize very quickly that while people lie, numbers are fundamentally incapable of deception. 2 years ago, a global shipping conglomerate lost a $5 million cargo manifest somewhere between a port in Rotterdam and a receiving dock in Boston. 3 senior directors panicked, prepared to write off the loss and fire the ground team. I locked myself in a windowless office for 72 hours. I did not panic. I went into what I call ER mode. I shut down all emotional responses, suppressed my need for sleep, and let the raw data dictate the narrative. I traced that missing freight across 3 separate state lines by locating a single transposed decimal point in a digitized customs form. A simple clerical error executed on purpose to route high-end electronics to an unregistered black market warehouse. I found the discrepancy. I recovered the freight. I understand how to read the hidden spaces between the numbers. I know how to find the leak in the hull. I opened Grandpa Henry's ledger. The pages smelled of aged paper and faint cedar. I applied that exact same clinical focus to the cramped, handwritten columns. The first hour of reading felt like walking blindly through a dense forest. Henry used a personal shorthand, a complex system of cross-references tying specific calendar dates to specific bank routing codes. But my brain is wired to identify patterns. By the second hour, the cipher broke open in my mind. The forest cleared, revealing a barren, devastating landscape of systemic theft. Brent portrayed himself to the world as a self-made real estate visionary. He wore bespoke Italian suits and attended local charity galas, acting as the reigning king of the coastal property market. The ledger proved his entire empire was a paper-thin illusion, built on a foundation of stolen soil. Starting 4 years ago, Brent began siphoning capital from Henry's primary contracting business. It started small, $5,000 routed to an LLC labeled for heavy equipment maintenance, $10,000 funneled to a vendor account that did not actually exist. I opened my laptop and pulled up the county property tax database. I cross-referenced the dates in the ledger with the public real estate records. The correlation was undeniable. Every time Brent purchased a new flip property, a corresponding drain occurred in Henry's corporate accounts. But real estate flipping requires a continuous, heavy influx of liquid cash to survive market dips and structural renovations. When the Maine coastal market softened 2 years ago, Brent did not scale back his operations. He doubled down. He needed capital to pay his specialized contractors, cover his soaring holding costs, and maintain the lavish lifestyle he used to project success. The ledger documented how the skimming escalated into outright severe embezzlement. He forged authorization signatures, transferring staggering sums from Henry's personal retirement portfolios directly into his failing shell companies. Henry knew. He sat in his quiet study, watching his son drain the family legacy dry. He documented every single stolen dollar in this book, building an airtight, chronological case against his own flesh and blood. I pushed the leather-bound ledger aside and picked up the waterproof sleeve. I broke the heavy adhesive seal and slid the contents onto the table. 10 physical certificates rested against the wood. They were printed on thick security paper featuring intricate geometric borders and the unmistakable embossed crests of offshore banking institutions. Bearer bonds. In the modern era of encrypted digital banking, these instruments are relics. They function exactly like hard currency. Whoever physically holds the paper holds the wealth. There is no digital footprint, no named beneficiary attached to the serial numbers, no regulatory oversight from domestic tax agencies. Alongside the bonds were 3 metal safety deposit keys stamped with numeric codes matching financial institutions in the Cayman Islands. I calculated the printed denominations on the bonds. The total value exceeded $500,000. This was the unencumbered wealth Henry had preserved, the untouchable financial reserve he kept hidden from the grid. The logic clicked into place with the precision of a locking tumbler. Brent did not want the rusted Ford because he needed collateral for a bank loan. No legitimate financial institution would leverage a decaying 1978 pickup truck against a failing commercial real estate portfolio. Brent wanted the truck because he knew his father kept a secret reserve of untraceable capital. Brent was drowning in debt. His creditors were circling his properties. He knew Henry was auditing the family accounts before his heart gave out. Brent likely tore apart the coastal properties, searching under floorboards and behind wall safes, trying to find the ledger that could send him to prison and the bonds that could save his life. Henry anticipated the desperate search. He knew his arrogant son viewed the old Ford pickup as a useless eyesore, a relic of a blue-collar past Brent desperately wanted to escape. Brent would never risk dirtying his tailored wool coats, crawling under the hood of a machine he found so beneath his dignity. Henry hid the ultimate evidence and the ultimate salvation inside the one object Brent despised. He welded it to the firewall and left the keys to the granddaughter, who understood the value of looking closer. The sister everyone else dismissed as the quiet workhorse. I reached the final page of the leather-bound ledger. Henry had written a brief addendum. It was dated just weeks before his final hospitalization. The handwriting was shaky, lacking the rigid structural precision of the earlier pages. It outlined a secondary legal protocol designed to execute if the embezzlement was ever exposed. I leaned in, tracing the faded blue ink with my index finger. The protocol referenced a second hidden document, a document that would rewrite the entire distribution of the estate. Before I could decipher the specific legal terminology, a sound shattered the heavy silence of my apartment. Ring! The doorbell chimed. I froze in my chair. I checked the digital clock on my laptop screen. It was exactly 10 o'clock at night. I lived in a secure building. Unannounced visitors did not make it past the lobby vestibule without a resident buzzing them through the intercom system. Whoever was standing in my hallway had bypassed the main security door by waiting for a neighbor to enter or exit. Ring. The chime echoed again, louder and more insistent this time. I carefully slid the ledger and the bearer bonds back into the waterproof sleeve. I shoved the sleeve under a stack of mundane mail at the far end of the dining table. I walked softly toward the front door, suppressing the sound of my footsteps against the hardwood floor. I leaned forward and pressed my eye against the glass peephole. Standing under the harsh fluorescent light of the corridor was my sister-in-law, Jessica. She held a designer handbag and a forced, tight smile. The hunt had arrived at my doorstep. I stood motionless behind the heavy oak door, my eye pressed flush against the cool glass of the peephole. Jessica stood in the hallway corridor, adjusting the lapels of her camel hair coat. Even under the unflattering hum of the fluorescent corridor lights, she maintained a rigid, artificial perfection. Her blonde hair was styled in a flawless salon blowout. Her posture was erect, projecting the specific type of aggressive confidence required to close multi-million-dollar coastal real estate deals. She checked her reflection in the dark screen of her smartphone. Her mouth was curved into a smile that did not extend to the sharp, calculating geometry of her eyes. It was a smile painted on, like a threat. I unlocked the deadbolt and slid the brass chain free. I pulled the door open a few inches, blocking the threshold with my body. Jessica did not wait for an invitation. She placed a manicured hand flat against the wood paneling and pushed the door wider, stepping directly into my entryway. The cloying scent of expensive floral perfume flooded the small space, immediately overwhelming the stale, neutral air of my apartment. Keva, honey, she beamed, her voice a syrupy octave higher than her natural speaking tone. She reached out and grasped my upper arm, squeezing it with exaggerated affection. I am so glad you are home. I tried calling, but it went straight to voicemail. I know it is terribly late to drop by unannounced, but I just had to see you. I gently extracted my arm from her grip. I looked past her shoulder, ensuring the hallway was empty, before closing the door. You bypassed the lobby intercom, Jessica. How did you get upstairs? She waved her hand dismissively, her heavy gold bracelets clinking together. Oh, some nice young man was walking out with his dog and held the door open for me. Listen, Keva, I came over because I feel just awful about how Brent behaved at the lawyer's office yesterday. He is under so much pressure with the commercial developments right now. Sometimes he lets his stress bleed into his tone. He was harsh and unfair. I want to make things right between us. I really do. When dealing with complex logistics supply chains, you learn to categorize incoming data. A sudden change in operational behavior is an anomaly. Jessica avoiding a confrontation would be standard protocol. Jessica showing up at my apartment late at night expressing genuine remorse was a blaring klaxon warning of an incoming crisis. In the 10 years she had been married to my brother, she had never once initiated a private conversation with me, let alone offered an apology for his arrogance. She viewed me as a dull, utilitarian fixture in the family dynamic, useful for managing Grandma's hospital visits, but entirely irrelevant to her social ambitions. I stepped back, leaning against the hallway wall, crossing my arms over my chest. I kept my expression entirely neutral, maintaining the sterile, detached focus of ER mode. What do you want, Jessica? She let out a bright, breathy laugh that sounded like glass shattering. Straight to the point as always, Keva. I appreciate that about you. No nonsense. She unclasped the gold latch of her oversized Prada handbag. She reached inside and pulled out a thick, bound stack of currency. She held it out toward me. The edges of the bills were sharp and crisp, fresh from a teller drawer. $2,000, she said, her painted smile widening. Cash. No tax forms, no estate transfer delays. I stared at the money. Why are you offering me $2,000? She took a step closer, invading my personal space. I have a very wealthy client from Boston, an older gentleman, relocating to the coast. He just purchased a massive, sprawling estate in Kennebunkport. We are staging the property this weekend for a major architectural magazine feature. He wants that authentic, rustic Maine aesthetic. Reclaimed barnwood, vintage lobster traps, the whole coastal heritage vibe. That rusted 1978 pickup truck you inherited is exactly the prop piece he needs, sitting in the gravel turnaround by the main barn. It is purely cosmetic. He will not even start the engine. I can take the title off your hands tonight, arrange a flatbed transport for the morning, and you walk away with a nice cash bonus. It is a win for everyone. It was a brilliantly constructed tactical maneuver, a classic red herring. She offered a highly plausible, friendly-sounding business excuse designed to mask her true objective. The logic was sound on the surface. Wealthy out-of-state buyers frequently paid exorbitant premiums for distressed local artifacts to manufacture an illusion of authenticity. For a split second, I almost admired the strategy. If I were the bitter, financially struggling sister they assumed I was, I might have snatched the cash and signed over the keys without a second thought. $2,000 was significantly more than the scrapyard would offer. It provided a graceful exit ramp from the escalating family tension. But I had spent the last 2 hours deciphering a leather-bound ledger detailing 4 years of systemic embezzlement. I knew the rusted Ford was currently hiding a waterproof sleeve containing $500,000 in untraceable bearer bonds. And I knew the vehicle was safely secured inside a climate-controlled shipping container at a commercial freight yard far out of her reach. I did not look at the cash. I looked at Jessica. I studied the micro-expressions flitting across her perfectly contoured face. Her smile remained locked in place, but the muscles in her jaw were tight. Her eyes were not looking at me. They were darting rapidly past my shoulder, scanning the dim interior of my apartment. Her gaze lingered on the closed door of my bedroom down the hall. She was searching for the truck keys. She was calculating whether I had already retrieved whatever assets Brent suspected were hidden inside the vehicle. Jessica was a woman who guarded her wealth fiercely. She did not hand out thick stacks of crisp $100 bills to solve sentimental disagreements. She deployed cash to extinguish fires before they burned down her house. I slowly uncrossed my arms. I let the silence stretch, stretching the tension in the hallway until the air felt brittle. "That is a very generous offer, Jessica," I said, keeping my voice flat and devoid of inflection. "But I think I will keep the Ford for sentimental value. Grandpa Henry taught me how to rebuild a carburetor on that engine block. It holds memories." The rejection hit her like a physical strike. The syrupy sweetness evaporated from her demeanor instantly. The bright painted smile shattered, revealing a vicious sneer. Her eyes hardened, turning cold and predatory. She shoved the stack of bills back into her designer handbag, snapping the gold clasp shut with a violent click. "Do not be stupid, Keva," she snapped, her voice dropping the artificial high octave. "You live in a cramped apartment. You do not even have a covered parking space. You cannot afford the commercial liability insurance on a decaying piece of scrap metal. You are being stubborn just to spite your brother." The mask had slipped entirely. The desperate, frantic reality beneath their curated luxury lifestyle was exposed. They needed control of that vehicle immediately. The fact that she was pushing this hard meant the financial walls were closing in on Brent faster than I had calculated. The offshore bonds were not a long-term safety net. They were the immediate life raft. I reached past her and pulled the front door open, gesturing toward the dimly lit corridor. "It is late, Jessica. I have an early shift at the shipping terminal tomorrow. Please leave." She stared at me, her chest heaving slightly under the camel hair coat. She looked like she wanted to scream, like she wanted to tear through my apartment and find the keys herself. But the calculated real estate agent regained control, overriding the panicked wife. She adjusted her collar, smoothing the fabric with a trembling hand. "You are making a massive mistake, Keva," she hissed, stepping over the threshold into the hallway. "Brent is not going to let you drag this family down over a pile of junk. We will deal with this tomorrow." I did not reply. I shut the heavy oak door firmly and engaged the deadbolt. I slid the brass security chain back into its track, locking it into place. I walked immediately to the dining table and pulled out my notebook. I documented the exact time of her arrival, the specific amount of the cash bribe, and the precise wording of her threat. In the logistics industry, if a transaction is not documented, it never happened. I was building a chronological chain of custody for every action they took. The panic was setting in on their side of the board. The red herring had failed. The bribery attempt had been rebuffed. The truck was secured out of their physical reach. But cornered, desperate people do not simply surrender. They escalate their tactics, shifting from manipulation to direct, unauthorized force. If they could not buy the asset from me, they would attempt to alter the legal ownership of the asset itself. The conflict was about to move from the physical world into the digital sphere, and I needed to prepare my defenses for a cyber intrusion. The Maine coastal fog had burned off by Tuesday morning, leaving a brittle, sharp chill in the air. I sat at my dining table, the remnants of yesterday's standoff echoing in the quiet apartment. I logged into my secured email account to check the overnight shipping manifests. Nestled between automated port authority updates and cargo delay notifications was an unread message from the Maine Bureau of Motor Vehicles. The subject line read, "Electronic Title Transfer Confirmation." I clicked the email. The digital document loaded onto my screen. It was a formal notification acknowledging the receipt of a release of liability for a 1978 Ford F-150. The form listed my full legal name, my current residential address, and, most chillingly, the last 4 digits of my Social Security number. The document authorized the immediate transfer of ownership from the estate trust directly into a corporate holding entity. The digital signature line bore a stylized electronic rendering of my name, time-stamped at 2 a.m. The escalation had shifted gears rapidly. They had moved past physical intimidation and cash bribery directly into felony identity theft. Jessica and Brent were no longer trying to negotiate for the asset. They were attempting to legally overwrite my ownership by forging state documents. In supply chain logistics, a forged bill of lading is a critical security breach. It means a malicious actor has penetrated the administrative layer of your operation. I did not panic. I opened a new browser window and accessed the specific digital tracking tools I utilized for maritime freight security. Every digital transaction leaves a footprint. When someone submits an electronic form to a government portal, the server logs the originating Internet Protocol address. Identifying that numerical string requires accessing the metadata embedded in the confirmation receipt. I ran a standard trace on the originating submission data. The ping routed through a commercial internet service provider in Portland. I cross-referenced the static IP block against public commercial registry data. The physical location resolved to a high-end commercial office suite in the downtown district. It was the exact registered address of Coastal Premier Properties, Jessica's luxury real estate brokerage. She had used her office network under the cover of darkness to forge the DMV transfer. I printed the email confirmation. I printed the technical readout of the IP trace. I placed both documents into a clear plastic sleeve. I retrieved the leather-bound ledger detailing the 4 years of systemic embezzlement from the waterproof bag. I compiled the evidence into a thick, rigid manila folder. The data was undeniable. It established a clear pattern of financial fraud, culminating in a direct attempt to steal a protected asset. I drove to the local police precinct. The building was an older brick structure, smelling faintly of floor wax and stale coffee. I bypassed the main dispatch desk and asked to speak directly with Chief Higgins. Higgins was a fixture in the community. He had broad shoulders, a silver mustache, and a reputation for handling matters quietly. He knew my grandfather well. He welcomed me into his office, gesturing to a wooden chair opposite his cluttered desk. "Have a seat, Keva," he said. his voice a low, comforting rumble. I was sorry to hear about Henry. He was a good man, a real pillar of this town. How are you holding up? I sat down, placing the heavy manila folder squarely on the center of his desk. I am holding up fine, Chief. I am here to report a crime. I pushed the folder toward him. Last night, someone submitted a forged electronic release of liability to the state DMV, attempting to transfer the title of the vehicle my grandfather left me. The submission used my Social Security number without my authorization. I ran a trace on the originating IP address. It traces directly back to my sister-in-law's commercial real estate office. Furthermore, I have recovered internal ledgers indicating a long-term pattern of financial theft targeting the estate. Higgins frowned. He did not open the folder immediately. He leaned back in his leather chair, intertwining his thick fingers, resting them on his stomach. He looked at me with an expression I could not quite categorize. It was not the sharp, attentive gaze of an investigator. It was the weary, practiced look of a man trying to diffuse a neighborhood noise complaint. Kiva, he began, his tone shifting from welcoming to patronizingly gentle. Grief does strange things to a family. It amplifies tensions. It makes small misunderstandings feel like deliberate attacks. I kept my posture rigid. This is not a misunderstanding, Chief. This is identity theft. The IP trace is conclusive. The attempt to seize the asset is documented. Higgins let out a heavy, slow sigh. He reached forward and tapped the cover of the manila folder with his index finger, but he did not lift the flap. Brent is a respected businessman in this community, Kiva. He sits on the hospital board. He sponsors the annual Harbor Festival. Jessica runs one of the most successful brokerages in the county. They are dealing with the stress of settling a complex estate. Sometimes paperwork gets filed prematurely in the rush to close accounts. I stared at him, the clinical detachment of ER mode keeping my voice steady. You do not accidentally input someone else's Social Security number at 2 a.m. to transfer a title you do not own. That is a deliberate felony. Higgins leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk, closing the physical distance between us. He lowered his voice, adopting a conspiratorial tone. Let us be realistic here, Keva. You are talking about a rusty old pickup truck. It is practically scrap metal. Brent likely thought he was doing you a favor handling the administrative disposal. Do you really want to drag your own brother, your own family, through a criminal investigation over a piece of junk? This is a civil family dispute. You need to sit down with Brent and work this out privately. Do not force me to open a file that is just going to tear your mother apart. He slid the manila folder back across the desk toward me. He had not looked at a single page of the evidence. A realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The logic clicked into place, rewriting the dynamics of the situation. I looked at the framed photographs lining the wall behind Higgins' desk. Nestled between pictures of police academy graduating classes and civic awards was a casual snapshot taken at a charity golf tournament. Higgins was standing on a manicured green, smiling broadly, holding a putter. Standing directly next to him, slinging an arm over the chief's shoulder, was Brent. I was playing on a rigged board. The system in this small coastal town was not designed to protect the quiet, reliable citizens. It was designed to insulate the wealthy, the loud, and the connected. Higgins was Brent's weekly poker buddy, his golf partner, his social peer. He would never initiate a criminal probe against a man who shared his social standing based on the accusations of the unglamorous sister. He would bury the file, classifying it as a petty domestic squabble. I reached out and pulled the manila folder back off the desk. I stood up, smoothing the front of my jacket. You are right, Chief, I said, my voice devoid of any emotion. It is a family matter. I will handle it. I turned and walked out of the office, navigating the sterile hallways of the precinct until I reached the cold air of the parking lot. I climbed into my daily driver, a reliable late-model sedan, and gripped the steering wheel. The coastal wind buffeted the side of the car, but inside the cabin, the silence was absolute. The rejection by local law enforcement was a catastrophic failure in my initial operational timeline. But in maritime logistics, when a primary port refuses a cargo manifest, you do not abandon the freight. You reroute the ship to a deeper harbor. I could not rely on local authorities to dismantle Brent's empire. The municipal power structure was compromised. If I wanted to stop the theft, protect my grandfather's legacy, and defend myself against further identity fraud, I needed to elevate the conflict beyond their sphere of influence. I needed to construct a federal wire fraud case so dense, so documented, and so undeniable that no small-town police chief could bury it in a desk drawer. I had to become my own lead investigator. I had to audit every transaction, trace every shell company, and map the entire network of corruption. The battle line had been drawn, and I was entirely on my own. But as I shifted the car into reverse and checked the backup camera monitor, I noticed a subtle shadow moving near the rear bumper. The enemy had already anticipated my next move, and they were tightening the net. I shifted the car into reverse and checked the backup camera monitor. The screen displayed the damp asphalt of the police precinct parking lot, but a subtle geometric distortion caught my eye. A rigid rectangular shadow clung to the lower edge of the rear bumper guard. I put the transmission back into park. I did not turn my head to scan the surrounding vehicles. If Brent or a hired private investigator sat idling in a parked car nearby, any sudden erratic movement would signal that I had spotted their surveillance. I opened the driver door and stepped out into the biting coastal wind. I pulled my coat tight and walked toward the rear of the sedan. I dropped my car keys onto the wet pavement, deliberately fumbling them near the back tire. I crouched down, resting one knee on the cold asphalt, reaching for the keys while sliding my free hand up under the dark recess of the wheel well. My fingertips brushed against cold road grit before making contact with a smooth, matte plastic casing. I traced the edges of the foreign device. It was roughly the size of a thick deck of playing cards, secured to the steel chassis by a heavy industrial magnet. I ran my thumb over a small indentation on the side, feeling a single faint green diode pulsing rhythmically. It was a commercial-grade global positioning tracker. My first instinct was primal. I wanted to rip the plastic box from the metal frame, throw it onto the asphalt, and crush it under the heel of my boot. I wanted to shatter their window into my life. But the cold, detached discipline of my profession took over, overriding the surge of anger. In maritime supply chain management, you never destroy a hijacked tracking transponder. Destroying the signal alerts the hostile party that their operation is compromised, prompting them to change tactics and strike from a new, unpredictable angle. You do not alert the enemy. You redirect them. I left the tracker securely fastened to the chassis. I picked up my keys, stood up, and climbed back into the driver's seat. I pulled out of the precinct lot and merged onto the main coastal thoroughfare. Brent was not just forging state documents from the comfort of his luxury office. He had crossed a physical boundary. He was stalking my movements, waiting for me to lead him to the exact location of the rusted pickup truck. He needed the bearer bonds and the ledger. He knew his time was running out. I drove straight to the commercial shipping terminal in Portland. This was my territory. The port is a sprawling industrial labyrinth of towering steel cranes, stacked corrugated containers, and heavy diesel machinery. It operates 24 hours a day, a chaotic symphony of maritime commerce. Security here is rigid, designed to keep unauthorized personnel out while facilitating the constant flow of international freight. I navigated the security checkpoints, flashing my corporate identification badge to the guards. The heavy chain-link gates rolled open, granting me access to the inner yard. I parked my sedan near the primary outbound loading dock. The air here smelled of salt brine, engine exhaust, and wet iron. I stepped out and walked to the rear of my car. I reached under the bumper and firmly gripped the plastic casing of the GPS tracker. I pulled hard, breaking the magnetic seal. The device felt dense in my palm, the internal battery pack giving it a satisfying weight. I walked across the damp concrete toward a staging lane, where a dozen long-haul semi-trucks sat idling their massive diesel engines, rumbling a deep vibration you could feel in your chest. I checked my digital logistics tablet. I located a specific Peterbilt rig, scheduled for a cross-country freight route. The manifest indicated the driver was hauling heavy machinery parts directly to a distribution warehouse in Seattle, Washington. The journey would take nearly a week. I approached the idling Peterbilt. The driver was inside the dispatch office finalizing his bill of lading. I knelt beside the massive rear dual tires of the trailer. I reached under the heavy steel undercarriage, finding a clean patch of metal near the suspension leaf springs. I pressed the magnetic tracker firmly against the steel frame. It locked into place with a sharp, metallic snap. The green diode blinked once, affirming its connection to the satellite network. Let Brent spend his weekend staring at a digital map, watching his precious surveillance dot accelerate to 70 miles per hour across the American Midwest. He would drain his resources trying to intercept a truck filled with nothing but industrial ball bearings. With the decoy deployed, I needed to secure the actual asset. I left my sedan at the terminal and signed out a discreet, unmarked corporate utility van from the motor pool. I drove back through the back streets of the industrial park, returning to Dave's auto and diesel garage. The rusted 1978 Ford F-150 sat in the corner of the gravel lot exactly where I had left it. Dave tossed me the keys, holding my gaze for a brief second, but asking no questions. I climbed into the cab of the Ford. The engine protested, sputtering and knocking as I navigated it out of the lot. I drove the dying vehicle back to the commercial shipping terminal, entering through a specialized cargo gate. I had already accessed the internal corporate registry, leasing a 20-foot climate-controlled shipping container under a dummy corporate shell name named Apex Maritime Storage. I pulled the Ford up a steel ramp and drove it deep into the cavernous belly of the corrugated steel container. The interior was dry, sterile, and temperature regulated. I cut the ignition. The old engine fell silent. I stepped out of the cab and walked back down the ramp. I swung the heavy steel doors of the shipping container shut. The heavy metal hinges groaned. I engaged the primary locking bar and secured it with a specialized hardened steel padlock rated for international maritime transit. I ran my hand over the cold corrugated steel. The truck, the vault, and its secrets were now completely locked down. No one could access this unit without bypassing federal port security terminal guards and a hardened lock they did not possess the key to open. I had effectively removed the physical asset from the board. I drove my sedan back to my apartment complex, the sun setting over the Atlantic, casting long gray shadows across the city. The weekend was mine. The tracker was heading west. The truck was invisible. I finally had the isolated operational window I needed to fully audit the leather-bound ledger and compile the federal fraud case against my brother. I returned to my dining table, the blackout curtains still drawn tight. I pulled the waterproof sleeve from its hiding place and laid the ledger flat under the pendant light. I opened my laptop, logging into the county property tax database to begin cross-referencing the corporate shell companies Brent had utilized to funnel the embezzled funds. The first 2 years of the ledger mapped perfectly to his initial real estate flips, small commercial properties renovated and sold at a marginal profit using stolen seed capital. But as I turned to the pages detailing the third year, the financial architecture shifted. The market had contracted. His properties were sitting vacant, generating massive holding costs instead of revenue. The numbers in the ledger spiked, indicating a desperate, frantic pull of resources from my grandfather's primary accounts. I traced a specific sequence of routing numbers corresponding to a staggering withdrawal executed 18 months prior. The amount was staggering. It was not routed to a construction firm or an architectural vendor. It was routed to a regional commercial bank. I typed the routing number and the transaction date into the public registry search bar. I hit the enter key. The database processed the query, pulling a scanned image of a formal lending document. I stared at the screen, the breath freezing in my lungs. The document was a commercial lien, a binding legal claim against a physical property used to secure a high-risk bridge loan. The amount of the loan matched the ledger withdrawal down to the final cent, $400 dozen. But it was the address of the collateral property listed on the lien that caused a cold spike of dread to pierce my stomach. The address did not belong to a commercial warehouse or a luxury coastal flip. It was the residential address of a modest single-family home in the suburbs. It was the home where I grew up. It was the house currently occupied by my mother, Susan. I scrolled down to the bottom of the scanned legal document. There, resting on the signature line of the guarantor, was my mother's name. The signature was slightly rigid, lacking the fluid loops of her natural handwriting. It looked like a forgery. Brent had secretly leveraged his own mother's primary residence to secure a bailout loan for his failing empire. I pushed my chair back from the table, the legs scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. The parameters of the war had changed again. This was no longer just about protecting my grandfather's legacy or defending myself from identity theft. Brent had placed a ticking financial time bomb under our mother's roof. If his creditors called in those debts, she would be evicted and left destitute. I grabbed my coat and my keys. I needed to warn her. I needed to show her the forged lien and explain exactly what her golden boy had done behind her back. But as I drove through the dark suburban streets toward her house, I had no idea that the victim I was rushing to save was holding a secret that would shatter my entire understanding of our family. The drive to my mother's house in the sprawling, quiet suburbs north of Portland felt like navigating a tunnel. The streetlights flickered against the wet pavement, casting long, distorted shadows across the manicured lawns. I parked in the driveway behind Susan's pristine, compact crossover. The house looked exactly as it had for the last 20 years: white clapboard siding, neat dark green shutters, and a meticulously maintained front garden. It was a portrait of stable, middle-class American security. It was entirely fake. I walked up the front steps, my hand gripping the manila folder containing the printed copy of the commercial lien. I unlocked the front door with my spare key. The interior of the house was warm, smelling of vanilla candles and baked apples. Susan was standing in the kitchen, leaning over the granite island, sorting through a stack of mail. She wore a soft beige cashmere cardigan, her silvering hair perfectly styled. She looked up as I walked in, her expression shifting from mild surprise to a tense, guarded smile. "Keva," she said, her voice carrying a thin, artificial brightness. "I did not expect you tonight. Did you bring the estate release forms? Brent mentioned you might be ready to settle that business with the truck." I did not return the smile. I walked to the opposite side of the granite island, placing the heavy manila folder on the polished stone surface. I opened the flap and extracted the single printed page, displaying the $400,000 commercial lien against her home. I slid the document across the counter, stopping right in front of her perfectly manicured hands. "I am not here about the truck, Mom. I am here about this." I kept my voice gentle, treating her the way I would approach a victim in shock. "Look at the paper. Brent is bankrupting you. He used a forged power of attorney to leverage this house, securing a massive bridge loan to cover his failing commercial properties. His creditors are circling. If his shell companies default, the bank is going to foreclose on this property. You will lose everything." I waited for the realization to hit her. I expected confusion, followed by denial, and then the horrifying realization of betrayal. I braced myself to hold her as she processed the devastation of her son's actions. Susan stared at the printed document. Her eyes scanned the legal terminology, tracing the typed address and the bold numeric figure. Her face began to crumple, the rigid lines of her forced smile collapsing. Her shoulders slumped forward, and she reached up to press her palms against her cheeks. A low, ragged sob escaped her throat. But as I watched her breakdown, the clinical detachment of my logistics training registered a critical discrepancy. Her reaction was wrong. When a victim discovers a devastating hidden truth, their physical response is outward. They pull back from the document, they shake their head, they seek eye contact for validation or denial. Susan did not pull back. She leaned into the counter, burying her face in her hands, physically retreating into herself. This was not the shock of sudden discovery. This was the crushing weight of an exposed secret. "I know," she whispered, her voice muffled by her hands. The single phrase hit me with the force of a physical strike. The room seemed to tilt, the warm, vanilla-scented air suddenly feeling thin and unbreathable. I gripped the edge of the granite island, locking my knees to steady myself. "What do you mean, you know?" I asked, the gentleness bleeding out of my voice, leaving only a cold, hard edge. Susan lowered her hands. Her eyes were red-rimmed, swimming with tears. She looked at the printed lien, then looked up at me, her expression a toxic mixture of shame and desperate pleading. "I signed it, Keva," she cried, a fresh wave of tears spilling over her cheeks. "I signed the power of attorney. He brought the papers here 18 months ago. He was frantic. He said the real estate market had shifted unexpectedly and his holding costs were drowning him. He said it was just a temporary bridge loan, just a 6-month leverage to save his business until the coastal properties sold. He promised me he would clear the title before the year was over." The pieces of the puzzle realigned, forming a picture far uglier than simple embezzlement. My mother was not a victim of forgery. She was an active participant in the financial manipulation. "He promised you," I repeated the words, tasting like ash in my mouth. "Mom, he did not just take a loan against your house. For 4 years, he has been systematically draining Grandpa Henry's primary business accounts. He embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars to fund a luxury lifestyle while his companies bled cash. He is broke. He cannot clear this title. The coastal properties are heavily leveraged. He is drowning, and he tied an anchor to your ankle to keep himself afloat." Susan grabbed the edge of the counter, her knuckles turning white. "No, you do not understand Brent's business. Real estate is cyclical. He just needs a little more time to liquidate the assets. That is why he needs you to sign over the truck, Keva." The sheer absurdity of the statement stopped my breathing. "Why does he need the truck, Mom? What did he tell you?" "He told me there is a secondary insurance policy attached to the vehicle identification number, a vintage classic car policy that pays out a significant lump sum if the vehicle is formally scrapped and the title is surrendered to the estate trust. He said that payout is exactly the amount he needs to satisfy the bank and release the lien on this house." I stared at her, the profound depth of Brent's manipulation laid bare. There was no vintage car insurance policy. Brent had constructed a secondary layer of lies specifically designed to weaponize our mother against me. He knew she would panic about losing her home. He fed her a fabricated story, making my refusal to surrender the truck the sole obstacle standing between her and financial salvation. He turned her into his most effective agent of coercion. "He lied to you, Mom," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "There is no insurance payout. The truck is hiding the physical evidence of his embezzlement. If I give him that truck, he destroys the only proof that he stole Grandpa's money. He walks away clean, and you still lose your house when the bank calls in the bridge loan." Susan shook her head violently, refusing to absorb the data. "You are just jealous, Keva. You have always been jealous of his success. You cannot stand the thought of helping him. If you expose him to the authorities, the bank will audit his files. They will see the defaulted accounts, and they will execute the lien. They will take my home. You have to give him the truck. Please, Keva, for me. Do this for your family." The betrayal solidified, settling heavy in my chest. She was not asking me to help her son. She was demanding I become an accomplice to his crimes. She wanted me to surrender the bearer bonds and destroy the ledger, allowing Brent to escape federal prosecution, all to maintain the illusion of her golden boy's success and protect her own poor decisions. She was willing to sacrifice my inheritance, my grandfather's legacy, and my personal integrity to cover up a felony. I looked around the pristine kitchen, the polished granite, the expensive stainless steel appliances, the framed family photographs lining the wall. It was a monument to a family dynamic that had always been toxic. Brent was the investment, I was the utility. When the investment failed, the utility was expected to absorb the loss. I reached across the counter and picked up the printed lien, sliding it back into the manila folder. I am not jealous of Brent, Mom. I am horrified by him, and I am not giving him the truck. Susan let out a sharp, ragged gasp. "You are going to let me go bankrupt. You are going to put your own mother on the street over a pile of rusted metal." I turned away from the granite island, walking slowly toward the front door. The internal conflict was agonizing, tearing at the fundamental biological instinct to protect a parent. If I moved forward with the federal wire fraud case, the resulting financial shockwave would trigger the bank to execute the lien. To destroy my brother and secure Grandpa's legacy, I had to actively risk my mother's home. It was a brutal, agonizing calculus. But as I placed my hand on the brass doorknob, I remembered sitting in the garage with Dave the mechanic, staring at the custom-welded lockbox. Henry had known. He watched his son drain the accounts, and he watched his wife enable the behavior. He knew the cost of exposing the truth would be catastrophic. But he built the vault anyway. He compiled the ledger because he believed the truth was more important than the illusion of stability. He left the keys to me because he knew I possessed the detached clinical discipline required to execute the final protocol. I opened the front door, the cold night air rushing into the warm, vanilla-scented hallway. "I am not putting you on the street, Mom," I said, looking back at her one last time. "Brent did that 18 months ago when you signed the paper. I am just refusing to pay the ransom." I walked out to my car, the heavy manila folder tucked under my arm. The emotional ties holding me to my family had snapped clean. I was no longer a daughter or a sister navigating a domestic dispute. I was a hostile auditor operating in enemy territory. I drove back to my apartment, the resolve hardening in my chest. I needed to finish reviewing the ledger. I needed to find the secondary legal protocol Henry had referenced in his final addendum. If I was going to risk tearing down my mother's life to stop Brent, I needed a weapon far more powerful than a financial audit. I needed absolute control of the board. And as I reached into the hidden compartment of the lockbox later that night, I found the exact ordinance Henry had prepared for the final strike. I returned to my downtown flat near midnight. The drive from the northern suburbs felt like navigating a dark, sensory void. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel until my knuckles ached. The lingering scent of vanilla from my mother's kitchen clung to my wool coat, acting as a sickening reminder of the deception I had just unearthed. My mother had chosen her golden boy. She had chosen the illusion of coastal high society over her own financial security and her relationship with her daughter. The emotional tether connecting me to my childhood home had snapped. I was untethered, but I was also unburdened. I locked the deadbolt and engaged the brass chain. My dining table remained a staging ground for the investigation. Resting in the center, next to the leather-bound ledger, was the matte black steel lockbox. I had unbolted the heavy cube from the engine bay of the Ford before sealing the pickup truck inside the shipyard container. Leaving the physical vault unguarded in a remote lot felt like an unacceptable operational risk. In the logistics industry, inspectors are trained to identify hidden spatial discrepancies. When auditing a 40-foot shipping container, you measure the exterior dimensions and compare them against the interior volume. If the math fails to reconcile, you have a false bulkhead. A void designed to conceal unauthorized freight. I applied this principle to the steel cube resting on my table. The exterior height of the box was 12 inches. The interior depth, measuring from the rim to the thermal foam floor, was only 9 inches. Taking the thickness of the steel casing into account, there was a 2-inch void unaccounted for at the base of the unit. Dave, the veteran mechanic, had muttered a passing comment about Grandpa Henry being a crafty ghost. Henry had not just built a vault, he had engineered a vault with a subterranean chamber. I reached inside the dark cavity. My fingertips traced the edges of the thermal protective foam lining the floor. I pressed down, applying firm pressure to the corners. The front left quadrant yielded slightly. I slipped my fingernail into the microscopic seam between the foam pad and the steel wall. I pulled upward. A rigid metal plate shifted, sliding smoothly along a hidden set of ball-bearing tracks. The false bottom retracted, revealing a shallow secondary compartment. Resting inside the hidden void was a thick envelope crafted from heavy, textured parchment. A dark crimson wax seal secured the flap, stamped with the formal insignia of a legal firm located in Delaware. Henry had bypassed his local attorney. He knew Mr. Sterling, the man who conducted the initial will reading, was too closely intertwined with the regional power structure. Sterling catered to the wealthy elite of Portland. He would have notified Brent the moment a change to the estate was drafted. To construct a truly secure protocol, Henry outsourced the legal architecture to an impartial jurisdiction. I broke the brittle crimson wax. The seal fractured into jagged pieces scattering across the mahogany table. I pulled a thick sheaf of legal documents from the envelope. The header on the first page identified the paperwork as a superseding last will and testament. It was dated a mere 6 months prior to my grandfather's passing, signed and authenticated by an out-of-state notary public. I read the opening declarations. The language was devoid of standard flowery legal preamble. It was sharp, precise, and devastatingly clear. I traced the typed text with my index finger, absorbing the structural shift in my reality. The specific clause occupied the center of the second page. Should any evidence of financial manipulation, forgery, or theft committed by Brent Bailey arise, the initial will, drafted by the Sterling firm, is voided in its entirety. The estate, encompassing all coastal real estate holdings, liquid investment portfolios, and primary commercial assets, transfers solely to Kiva Bailey to resolve all outstanding debts. The blood in my veins turned cold. The words on the page dismantled the entire foundation of my brother's empire. Henry had known the embezzlement was a fatal poison. He understood that leaving the assets to Brent would only feed the fraudulent shell companies and enrich the creditors. The initial will, the document that provoked laughter in that mahogany office, was bait. It was a temporary illusion designed to keep Brent complacent while the trap was set. I was no longer just the owner of a rusted pickup truck. According to the authenticated legal documents resting on my table, I was the sole legal inheritor of the entire Bailey family trust. The luxury properties Brent used to project his wealth, the business accounts he drained, the investment portfolios he leveraged. Legally, they belonged to me. Brent was a squatter, occupying my territory. But Henry was a thorough engineer. A superseding will triggered by evidence of fraud required airtight proof of that fraud to hold up in a probate court. He had provided the key, along with the lock. I reached back into the heavy parchment envelope and extracted a second folded document. It was a sworn affidavit, a formal confession bearing the signature of a retired regional bank manager. The text detailed a series of early, high-risk commercial loans granted to Brent's real estate firm. The manager admitted to bypassing mandatory collateral checks and ignoring blatant red flags in the financial disclosures. He confessed to facilitating the initial layers of the embezzlement scheme in exchange for lucrative kickbacks funneled through third-party consulting fees. The statute of limitations on the manager's personal liability had expired, but the document served as an authenticated historical record of Brent's criminal enterprise. Grandpa Henry had built a completely sealed, prosecutable federal case against his own son. He had gathered the financial ledgers, secured, the untraceable offshore bonds secured, a sworn confession from a complicit banker, and drafted a legal instrument granting me total control of the battlefield. He left me as the sole executor, arming me with an arsenal capable of leveling a corrupt dynasty. I spent the remainder of the long, dark weekend constructing my master organizational binder. I purchased a thick, rigid portfolio from a late-night office supply store. I utilized color-coded tabbed dividers to separate the distinct categories of evidence. Section 1 contained the IP trace and the forged state motor vehicle release linking Jessica to the cyber intrusion. Section 2 held the printed copy of the fraudulent commercial lien secured against my mother's suburban home. Section 3 housed the chronological financial ledgers mapping 4 years of systemic theft. Section 4 protected the sworn banker affidavit. The final section guarded the superseding will and the offshore bearer bonds. I was no longer a grieving sister navigating a toxic domestic dispute. I was a hostile auditor finalizing the operational blueprint for a total institutional takedown. The quiet, reliable workhorse had been handed the reins to the entire operation. I slept for a few hours on Sunday night, my mind processing the complex legal choreography required to execute the final protocol. When Monday morning arrived, the coastal fog retreated, yielding to a sharp, pale winter sun. I dressed for my shift at the logistics terminal, buttoning a crisp white-collared shirt under a dark tailored blazer. The binder sat inside my heavy leather satchel. I needed to retain a ruthless, specialized estate litigation attorney to initiate the federal filings. I walked to the corner cafe near my apartment building to purchase a black coffee before my commute. The barista handed me a paper cup. I swiped my debit card through the payment terminal. The machine processed the transaction, the small digital screen flashing a processing prompt. Then the machine emitted a sharp, negative tone. The screen glowed red, displaying a single, stark word: declined. I frowned. I carried a significant balance in my primary checking account. I swiped the plastic card a second time. The machine rejected the transaction again. The barista offered a sympathetic, apologetic smile. I stepped out of the cafe line, pulling my smartphone from my pocket. I logged into my mobile banking application. My primary checking account balance displayed 0 available funds. My savings account reflected the same disposable numeric void. A prominent red banner stretched across the top of the interface, indicating a formal administrative freeze. The trap had been sprung. Brent had realized his electronic surveillance tracker was currently sitting 1,000 miles away. He knew the red herring bribery had failed. He understood I was actively investigating his financial architecture. Denied physical access to the truck and unable to locate the hidden assets, he had deployed his final defensive countermeasure. He had weaponized his expensive legal team to sever my resource supply. The conflict had shifted from a quiet investigation into an active siege, and I had to survive the incoming assault without a single dollar to my name. I sat in the driver's seat of my sedan, gripping the steering wheel while the sterile hold music of my banking institution played through the Bluetooth speakers. The coastal morning sun offered light, but 0 warmth. The digital display on my dashboard confirmed the time. The business day had officially begun, but my financial existence had been abruptly severed. My primary checking account, my savings, my dedicated emergency funds, everything had been reduced to a sequence of zeros on a mobile application. A customer service representative finally answered the line. Her voice was polite, but carried the distinct, guarded tone of someone reading from a legal script. "I am sorry, Ms. Bailey," she said. "I am looking at your file now. Your accounts have not been closed, but they are under a strict administrative freeze." I kept my breathing steady. A freeze initiated by whom? "There is a notation here regarding an ex parte emergency court injunction," she replied. "The issuing authority is the county probate court. The legal hold references pending civil litigation involving allegations of elder financial exploitation and the unauthorized diversion of estate assets. We cannot release any funds until the court lifts the injunction. I advise you to contact your legal counsel immediately." I thanked the representative and ended the call. The cabin of my sedan was quiet except for the low hum of the heater. I leaned back against the headrest, staring out the windshield at the frost clinging to the edge of the glass. The strategic architecture of Brent's attack was brilliant in its cruelty. He knew he could not access the hidden offshore bearer bonds, and he knew he could not destroy the leather-bound ledger detailing his 4 years of systemic theft. He was trapped in a tightening vice of his own making. So he chose to asphyxiate my resource supply. By filing a frivolous emergency lawsuit accusing me of the exact crime he was committing, he had weaponized the local judicial system. An ex parte injunction meant his high-priced legal team from the Sterling firm had gone before a judge without notifying me, presenting a fabricated narrative of a grieving granddaughter manipulating a sick old man. Judges err on the side of caution in elder abuse claims. They sign the order freezing all disputed assets to prevent capital flight. Brent did not need the lawsuit to hold up under a rigorous trial. He just needed the temporary injunction to cut off my oxygen. He was hoping to starve me into a rapid settlement. He wanted me to experience the sheer terror of having my financial life erased overnight. I pictured him sitting in his pristine downtown office, the harbor view stretching out behind his leather chair, his smartphone resting on the polished desk. He was waiting for the screen to illuminate. He wanted me panicked. He expected me to call him screaming and begging for a truce, pleading for access to my own money to pay my rent and buy my groceries. He would record that frantic telephone call, using my emotional breakdown as authenticated proof that I was unstable and unfit to manage Grandpa Henry's legacy. I did not call him. I reached into my leather satchel and pulled out my physical wallet. I opened the billfold and conducted a stark audit of my available resources. I had 2 $20 bills and a handful of loose coins. My vehicle fuel gauge registered just under half a tank. I had $40 in cash to survive the immediate operational window. In maritime logistics, supply chain disruptions are an occupational certainty. A typhoon delays a cargo freighter in the Pacific. A labor strike shuts down a crucial port in Northern Europe. When the primary route fails, you do not sit on the dock and weep over the delayed freight. You calculate your remaining fuel, you map the secondary shipping lanes, and you simply move forward. I placed the 2 $20 bills back into my wallet. The pressure was immense, squeezing the air from my lungs. But a good engine runs quiet. I was going to let my brother rev his engine until the pistons shattered. I shifted the car into drive and headed toward the shipping terminal for my daily shift. I could not hire the specialized federal estate attorney I needed today. Retaining a lawyer capable of dismantling the Sterling firm required a substantial upfront retainer fee. But I did not need to hire the lawyer today. I needed to finish compiling the unassailable federal wire fraud case. I utilized the resources available to me. During my lunch break, I sat in my isolated cubicle at the logistics firm, surrounded by towering stacks of cargo manifests. I used the corporate printing infrastructure to generate high-resolution copies of every document in my master binder. I scanned the offshore bearer bonds, the forged state motor vehicle release, the fraudulent commercial lien against my mother's home, and the superseding will. I created 3 separate encrypted digital backups, storing them on secure remote servers. I functioned with the cold, precise efficiency of a machine. Monday evening bled into Tuesday. I managed my $40 with extreme discipline. I purchased inexpensive dry goods from a local market, cooking simple meals in my apartment. I kept my phone silent. The absence of my reaction must have been deafening to Brent. He had launched his most devastating tactical strike, and the target simply absorbed the impact without a sound. I imagined the frantic energy building inside his luxury real estate office. By Tuesday afternoon, his hired security team, or the private investigator tracking the GPS device, would have realized the signal was moving at a constant highway speed through the American Midwest. They would understand the tracker was attached to a commercial semi-truck carrying ball bearings to Seattle. The red herring had worked perfectly. Brent had wasted thousands of dollars and crucial hours chasing a ghost across the country, while the actual 1978 Ford pickup sat invisible inside a locked shipping container less than 5 miles from his office. The psychological warfare was shifting. My silence was a mirror reflecting his own impending ruin back at him. He knew I held the evidence. He knew his mother had confessed to signing the fraudulent mortgage lien. He knew his time was evaporating. By Wednesday morning, the coastal chill had deepened into a bitter, biting frost. I had $10 remaining in my wallet. My fuel gauge was dipping toward the reserve line. I needed to execute the next phase of the protocol, but I also needed a hot meal before facing the final legal hurdles. I decided to walk the 6 blocks from my apartment to a local breakfast diner I had frequented for years. It was a modest establishment serving strong black coffee and simple food to the early morning harbor crews. I stepped into the diner, the bell above the glass door chiming a bright welcome. The air was thick with the smell of sizzling bacon and roasted coffee beans. I slid into a vinyl booth near the back, pulling my heavy coat tight around my shoulders. I ordered a standard breakfast, keeping my focus trained on the digital timeline mapped out on my tablet. I was prepared for the long, slow legal grind of lifting the administrative freeze. I was prepared to present the superseding will to the probate court to bypass Brent's frivolous lawsuit. What I was not prepared for was the sudden, aggressive invasion of my physical space. The diner door swung open with a harsh, violent rattle. The ambient chatter of the breakfast crowd faltered, dropping into a sudden, uneasy hush. I looked up from my screen. Marching down the narrow aisle between the booths, their designer coats starkly contrasting with the worn flannel of the local patrons, were Brent and Jessica. The hunt had transitioned from the digital shadows into the harsh light of a public space. They had come to force the confrontation I had refused to give them, and they intended to use an audience to ensure my surrender. The breakfast diner was a cornerstone of the coastal community. It was the kind of establishment where local fishermen, mechanics, and longshoremen gathered before sunrise. These were people who understood the value of hard labor and quiet endurance. I had eaten eggs and drank black coffee at these cracked vinyl tables since I was a teenager. The waitstaff knew my name. The regular patrons recognized my face. This was my sanctuary. When Brent and Jessica marched through the glass door, the sudden shift in atmospheric pressure was palpable. They did not belong in this environment. Brent wore a sharp, tailored charcoal suit that screamed of high-end downtown boardrooms. Jessica was draped in an immaculate cream-colored trench coat, her heels clicking loudly against the worn linoleum floor. They bypassed the host stand entirely, their eyes scanning the crowded booths with predatory intent. Brent spotted me sitting in the back corner. He did not approach quietly. He stopped in the center of the main aisle, ensuring he commanded the visual attention of the entire dining room. He stood tall, squaring his shoulders, adopting the posture of a righteous, aggrieved patriarch. "Keva!" he shouted, his voice projecting with the practiced resonance of a man accustomed to commanding large construction sites. The clatter of silverware against ceramic plates ceased immediately. The low hum of morning conversation evaporated. Every head in the diner turned toward the sudden disruption. The locals I had known my entire life, the men and women who had watched me grow up alongside my grandfather, now stared at me with varying degrees of surprise and confusion. I did not flinch. I kept my hands resting flat on either side of my coffee mug, maintaining a posture of relaxed stillness. Brent took a deliberate step forward, pointing a rigid, accusing finger in my direction. "You are letting Mom lose her house," he bellowed, ensuring the words reached the furthest corners of the room. "You are letting the bank foreclose on the home she raised us in, because you are too bitter to return stolen estate property." A collective murmur rippled through the diner. In a tight-knit Maine community, abandoning your own mother to financial ruin is considered an unforgivable moral failure. Brent was playing to the crowd, expertly manipulating the local social currency. He was framing himself as the desperate, devoted son trying to save the family matriarch from the clutches of a greedy, spiteful sibling. Jessica moved to his side, playing her supporting role with theatrical precision. She reached into her designer handbag, extracting a crisp white tissue. She dabbed at the corners of her perfectly dry eyes, sniffing audibly. "She is just so greedy," Jessica stage whispered, leaning into Brent's shoulder, but projecting her voice clearly enough for the adjacent booths to hear. She took advantage of Henry when his mind was failing, and now she is trying to destroy us all. It was a brilliant, calculated ambush. They had exhausted their cyber intrusions, their physical surveillance, and their legal maneuvering. They were bankrupting their resources, chasing a decoy GPS tracker across the Midwest. The administrative freeze on my bank accounts had failed to produce the panicked, begging phone call they so desperately needed. This public shaming was their final, desperate weapon. They expected the sudden, intense public scrutiny to crush me. They assumed my quiet nature, my preference for order and systems, equated to social cowardice. They believed I would shrink away from the judging stares of my neighbors. They expected me to lower my head, gather my belongings, and flee the diner in tears, agreeing to whatever demands they set just to escape the humiliation. But as I sat in the vinyl booth, looking at my brother, the heavy, oppressive anxiety that had gripped my chest for the last 72 hours vanished. The dramatic irony of the situation washed over me, replacing fear with a profound, stabilizing calm. The people in this diner believed they were watching a wealthy, successful businessman reprimand a rogue sister. I knew the truth. I knew the man shouting in the center aisle was a drowning embezzler holding a forged portfolio. I knew the luxury suit he wore was purchased with stolen capital. I knew that according to the authenticated superseding will resting inside my leather satchel, I legally owned the very properties he used to project his authority. I was not the rogue sister. I was his landlord, his auditor, and his executioner. I did not raise my voice to match his volume. I reached into my satchel and retrieved a small, spiral-bound notepad and a pen. I clicked the pen open, the tiny mechanical sound sharp and distinct in the silent room. "Brent," I said, my tone entirely flat, devoid of any emotional inflection. I spoke with the exact clinical detachment I use to address a failing vendor on a shipping dock. "Are you referring to the estate you currently have a $400,000 commercial lien against?" The silence in the diner shifted. The collective judgment of the patrons fractured, replaced by a sudden, sharp curiosity. Brent froze. His extended accusing finger dropped slightly. His mouth opened, but the righteous anger died in his throat. He had not anticipated a direct, factual counterattack. He expected tears. He expected a defensive denial. He did not expect me to detonate his financial reality in public. I did not give him time to recover his footing. I maintained direct, unwavering eye contact. "Or are you referring to the high-risk bridge loans you secured using a complicit signature to mask the fact that your real estate companies have been hemorrhaging cash for 2 years?" The color drained from Brent's face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. The structural foundation of his public persona collapsed in real time. The locals sitting in the surrounding booths, the working-class men and women who despised corporate grifters, turned their gaze from me to him. The judging stares shifted instantly, their eyes now filled with hard, unforgiving scrutiny. They recognized the stark terror blooming on his face. Innocent men do not turn ghost white when confronted with financial data. Jessica dropped the tissue, her theatrical sobbing halting abruptly. She took a step back from Brent, physically distancing herself from the epicenter of the blast. "You do not know what you are talking about," Brent stammered, his voice cracking, stripped of its previous booming authority. I clicked my pen closed and dropped it back into my satchel. "I know exactly what I am talking about, Brent, and so does the county tax registry." I stood up, sliding out of the booth. I placed my final $10 bill on the table to cover my coffee and the untouched meal. I picked up my heavy coat and my leather satchel. I walked down the center aisle, moving deliberately past my brother and his wife. Neither of them moved to block my path. They stood paralyzed, trapped in the wreckage of their own failed ambush. I pushed through the glass door, stepping out into the cold morning air. The bell chimed a bright farewell. I walked toward my car, the adrenaline fading, leaving a clean, sharp focus in its wake. The public confrontation had fundamentally altered the trajectory of the conflict. I had not just defended myself, I had struck a fatal blow to Brent's regional reputation. The rumors would spread through the coastal community before noon. His remaining creditors would hear the whispers of a massive commercial lien and a failing empire. They would begin calling in his debts. The psychological warfare was over. The physical intimidation had failed. But the legal battlefield remained heavily mined. Brent still possessed the resources of the Sterling firm. He still had the administrative freeze locked on my bank accounts and the frivolous elder abuse lawsuit pending in the municipal court. I had survived the siege, but I was still operating on empty reserves in enemy territory. I needed to launch a forensic counterstrike so massive it would bypass the corrupt local authorities entirely. And to do that, I needed to hand the superseding will to a predator capable of hunting down a rogue real estate mogul. I did not return to my apartment after leaving the diner. I steered my sedan onto the interstate, leaving the coastal harbor behind. I needed to cross county lines. The local jurisdiction belonged to Brent and his connected social circle. I drove 40 miles north to a town built on corporate banking and maritime law. Tucked inside the leather ledger Grandpa Henry had left, a single business card. It belonged to a forensic accountant named Miriam Croft. Miriam operated out of a sterile glass office building overlooking a frozen river. She wore wire-rimmed glasses and possessed the sharp, calculating demeanor of a predatory bird. I sat across from her and placed the heavy master binder onto her glass desk. I did not offer a narrative preamble. I simply unclasped the rings and laid out the exhibits. The forged motor vehicle release, the Internet Protocol trace, the suburban mortgage lien, the chronological ledgers, the banker affidavit, the offshore bearer bonds, the superseding will. Miriam did not speak. For a full hour, the only sound in the office was the crisp turning of pages and the soft scratching of her mechanical pencil. I sat still, watching her dissect 4 years of my brother's life. She cross-referenced the tax identification numbers. She scrutinized the forged signatures. She read Henry's meticulous accounting. Finally, she closed the binder. She took off her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. "Your grandfather did 90% of my job, Keva," she stated. Her tone carried a deep professional respect. This is not a civil family dispute. This is federal wire fraud. It is identity theft. And given the manipulation of the suburban residential property, it crosses into bank fraud. We are bypassing the municipal police department. Miriam dialed the number on her desk phone. Within 30 minutes, a man walked into the conference room. His name was Marcus Thorne. He was a senior partner at a firm specializing in hostile estate litigation. He did not wear a flashy suit. He carried a battered leather briefcase and exuded a cold, pragmatic authority. I handed him the superseding will and the retired banker's confession. Thorne scanned the documents. His eyes locked onto the penalty clause Henry had drafted. A grim, predatory smile touched the corners of his mouth. He looked at me. "How do you want to handle this, Keva?" he asked. "I want the oxygen cut off," I replied. The counterstrike launched before noon. Thorne did not send warning letters. He did not invite Brent to negotiate a settlement. He utilized the raw, unyielding power of the judicial system. His paralegals filed the superseding will directly with the state probate court, accompanied by an emergency petition to freeze the existing trust. Simultaneously, Thorne compiled a comprehensive referral packet containing the digital trace data and the forged state forms. He bypassed Chief Higgins entirely, routing the package via secure courier straight to the Maine Attorney General Cybercrimes Division. I drove back to Portland. I did not text my brother. I did not call my mother. I returned to my logistics desk and resumed tracking shipping freighters. I let the slow, grinding machinery of federal law do the talking. The initial shockwave hit on Friday afternoon. I was reviewing a cargo manifest when my cell phone vibrated against the metal desk. It was a text message from a mutual acquaintance who managed a high-end catering company downtown. The message was brief. Brent's corporate platinum card just bounced at the country club. The management declined his account in front of a dozen prominent investors. The probate judge had reviewed Thorne's emergency petition and executed the freeze. The assets Brent relied upon to project his empire, the liquid cash, the credit lines, the business accounts, were suddenly locked inside a legal vault. The false floor he had been standing on evaporated into thin air. He had spent the week trying to starve me out with a frivolous injunction. In response, I had legally starved his entire corporate operation. I spent the weekend in my apartment enjoying the profound silence. I cooked simple meals and read maritime trade journals. The frantic, desperate energy that must have been consuming my brother's household felt light years away. He could no longer afford to pay his attorneys. He could no longer fund his private investigators. The GPS tracker attached to the decoy semi-truck was likely crossing the Rocky Mountains, but Brent no longer had the financial means to care. By Monday morning, the collateral damage expanded outward, hitting his supporting cast. I poured my morning coffee and opened my laptop to check the local business news feeds. A prominent alert flashed on the screen regarding Jessica's real estate brokerage. The agency had issued a terse public press release. Effective immediately, Jessica was no longer affiliated with Coastal Premier Properties. The state attorney general had acted on the referral packet. Federal agents served a preservation warrant on the brokerage servers to investigate the cyber intrusion linking her office terminal to the forged DMV documents. The managing broker terminated her contract on the spot to protect the firm from the incoming criminal probe. Jessica had spent her entire career curating a pristine luxury image. In the span of a single morning, she became a radioactive liability in the coastal property market. The curated luxury life they had weaponized against me was disintegrating in real time. They had no cash, they had no credit, they had no professional standing. They were trapped inside a collapsing structure with zero exit routes. The red herring had failed. The diner ambush had backfired. The forged documents had summoned federal agents to their doorstep. The trap was fully sprung, but the protocol required a final execution. Brent was cornered, desperate, and stripped of his armor. He needed to understand exactly who had dismantled his kingdom. He needed to face the quiet, reliable sister he had treated like a disposable utility. I picked up my phone and dialed Marcus Thorne. It was time to summon the remaining family members back to the starting line. We needed to schedule a meeting in the exact room where the laughter had started, and I knew precisely which documents I was bringing to the mahogany table. The mahogany conference room felt smaller than it had 2 weeks prior. The dry heat pumping through the ceiling vents smelled of lemon furniture polish and old paper. Mr. Sterling sat near the window, his usual confident posture replaced by a tense, rigid stillness. He knew his legal firm was under scrutiny. Sitting directly across from him, occupying the seat Sterling usually reserved for himself, was Marcus Thorne. My litigator did not wear a gold watch or a bespoke suit. He wore a simple charcoal jacket and kept his hands folded over a plain legal pad. He radiated a cold, silent gravity. I chose the chair at the head of the long, polished table. It was the exact seat Brent had claimed during the initial will reading. The heavy oak door swung inward. Brent entered first, followed by Jessica and my mother, Susan. The physical deterioration of my brother was stark. The arrogant real estate mogul who had mocked me in this very room was gone. His tailored trousers hung loosely around his waist. He adjusted his silk tie with a hand that carried a visible, persistent tremor. The confident, booming voice he used to project authority had vanished, leaving behind a hollow, fragile shell. Jessica walked in behind him, but she did not stand by his side. She moved to the far end of the leather seating arrangement, putting as much physical distance between herself and her husband as the room allowed. Her signature blonde blowout was pulled back into a severe, tight knot. She carried a generic canvas tote instead of her luxury designer handbag. The state investigation into her brokerage had stripped away her curated coastal elite persona. She looked like a cornered animal, scanning the perimeter for an escape route. Susan trailed behind them, her gaze fixed on the patterned carpet. The weight of the impending foreclosure on her suburban home pulled her shoulders down. She looked exhausted, carrying the heavy burden of the secrets she had helped conceal. She took a seat near the door, refusing to make eye contact with anyone at the table. I did not bring the rusted keys to the Ford pickup. I carried a heavy canvas duffel bag. I lifted the bag, placing it squarely on the polished mahogany surface. I unzipped the canvas and extracted the matte black steel lockbox. I set the metal cube down. The impact produced a resounding, heavy thud that echoed off the wood-paneled walls. The raw industrial steel, smeared with residual engine grease, stood in stark contrast to the sterile, refined elegance of the law office. Brent stared at the metal cube. His eyes darted from the lockbox to my face and then to Marcus Thorne. A pulse beat rapidly in the hollow of his throat. He tried to summon his former bravado, attempting to fill the silence with his usual noise. "What is this, Keva?" He snapped, his tone tight and defensive. His voice wavered, lacking its foundational support. "Did you finally bring the title? Are you signing over the truck so we can end this ridiculous circus?" I unclasped the heavy master binder resting in front of me. I turned to the first tabbed section. I did not raise my voice. I did not lean forward. I utilized the exact measured cadence I employ when terminating a contract with a fraudulent shipping vendor. "I am not here to negotiate, Brent," I said. "I am here to show Mom exactly what you inherited." I extracted a printed document from the binder. It was the technical readout provided by my CyberTrace identifying the origin of the forged motor vehicle release. I slid the paper across the smooth mahogany wood. It stopped directly in front of Jessica. "This is an internet protocol trace," I explained, keeping my gaze locked on my sister-in-law. "It proves that at 2 a.m, a terminal inside Coastal Premier Properties accessed the state database. Someone used that terminal to input my Social Security number and forge a legal transfer of ownership. The Attorney General already has the authenticated digital logs. That is why your managing broker fired you, Jessica. That is why federal agents seized your servers." Jessica let out a sharp, strangled gasp. Her hands flew to her mouth, covering her pale lips. She looked at the printed IP trace as if the paper were soaked in poison. She knew the Cybercrimes Division was investigating, but seeing the raw, undeniable proof laid bare on the table shattered her remaining defenses. She shrank back into the leather chair, her eyes wide with undisguised panic. Susan raised her head, looking at Jessica, and then at the document. "You tried to steal her identity," Susan whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of confusion and growing horror. "Brent told me the truck was a simple administrative transfer. He told me Kiva was just delaying the paperwork out of spite." I shifted my focus from Jessica directly to my brother. Brent was staring at the black steel lockbox. His mind was racing, trying to calculate the dimensions of the trap he had walked into. "You called the pickup truck junk," I said, my words precise and deliberate. "You laughed in this room and offered me $100 for the scrap fee. You mocked the one asset you thought was beneath your dignity. But Grandpa Henry was an engineer. He understood structural weaknesses. He knew you would tear apart the coastal houses looking for his private records. He knew you would scour the investment portfolios, and he knew you would never dirty your tailored suits by searching under the hood of a decaying, rusted vehicle." I reached out and rested my hand on the cold steel of the vault. "He had a mechanic weld this fireproof box to the firewall of that truck 5 years ago. He engineered a specific mechanical cipher into the broken dashboard radio, ensuring only someone who knew how to listen to the engine could open the latch. He hid his most critical cargo inside the one object you despised." Brent's hands gripped the edge of the mahogany table. His knuckles were bone white. He leaned forward, his breathing shallow and rapid. "What is in the box, Keva?" he demanded, his facade crumbling into raw, desperate fear. "What did he leave you?" I did not answer him immediately. I turned a page in my master binder, revealing the thick stack of chronological ledgers detailing his 4-year embezzlement scheme. The conflict was no longer about identity theft or a rusted truck. I was about to walk my mother through the exact mathematics of her golden boy's betrayal. She needed to see the precise dates he stole from her father, and she needed to see the undeniable proof that her own suburban home was merely collateral damage in his failing empire. The reckoning was moving from the cyber realm into the cold, hard numbers of his financial ruin, and I was preparing to slide the ledger across the table. I kept my hand steady as I flipped to the third divider in my portfolio. I extracted a thick stack of photocopied pages taken directly from the leather-bound journal. I distributed the sheets across the polished mahogany surface, fanning them out so every person at the table possessed a clear, unobstructed view of the cramped, precise handwriting. "These are the internal accounting records Grandpa Henry maintained during his final 4 years," I stated. I looked directly at Susan. "Mom, I want you to read the dates listed in the left margin. I want you to look at the corresponding withdrawal amounts." Susan leaned forward, adjusting her posture. Her eyes scanned the numerical columns. I watched her index finger tremble as she traced a specific line item from 3 years prior. "Do you recognize that date, Mom?" I asked. "That was the same month Brent purchased the ski chalet in Aspen. The month he told you his commercial real estate firm had achieved record profits. Look at the ledger. He did not earn a profit. He routed $80,000 from the primary business operating account into a dummy shell corporation. He utilized his own father's retirement funds to finance a luxury vacation home while projecting an illusion of self-made success to the rest of the town." Brent drew a sharp breath. He reached out to snatch the paper, but Marcus Thorne cleared his throat. It was a low, warning sound that caused my brother to freeze mid-motion. "You cannot prove any of this," Brent muttered, though his tone lacked conviction. "Those are just scribbles on a page, an old man losing his mind, making up numbers to hurt his own son." I did not engage with his denial. My logistics training required a methodical presentation of the variables. I turned to the next tab in the binder. I pulled out the high-resolution scans of the offshore bearer bonds and the Cayman Islands banking codes. I placed them meticulously alongside the ledgers, aligning the edges. "Grandpa knew you were draining the domestic accounts, Brent." I continued, keeping my gaze locked on his pale face. "He anticipated your eventual bankruptcy. To protect the remaining legacy, he transferred his unencumbered wealth into physical, paper instruments, $500,000 in untraceable liquid capital. This is what you were searching for when you demanded I scrap the Ford. You needed this untraceable cash to satisfy the creditors circling your failing flips. You needed it to pay off the commercial lien you secretly attached to our mother's suburban residence." Susan let out a ragged gasp. She looked at Brent, her expression fracturing. The golden facade she had protected for decades was peeling away, revealing the severe rot underneath. He had assured her the bridge loan was a temporary measure, a standard business practice to weather a slow market. Now, the raw data proved he was drowning and had used her home as a disposable life raft. I then produced the notarized affidavit from the retired regional bank manager. I slid the sworn confession toward Mr. Sterling. The elder attorney adjusted his reading glasses, his face turning ash gray as he read the admitted conspiracy. Sterling understood the profound implications of the document. It meant his own legal firm had unknowingly drafted contracts based on fraudulent lending practices. "The banker confessed," I noted, addressing the entire room. "He detailed the kickbacks he received for approving your initial high-risk loans without proper collateral checks. The foundation of your entire empire is built on documented financial fraud. Every property you flipped, every luxury car you leased, was funded by stolen capital." Brent stared at the mountain of paper accumulating before him. The trap was closing. Every avenue of escape was sealed by an irrefutable chain of custody. He opened his mouth to speak, but I preempted his defense. I reached into the final section of my portfolio. I retrieved the heavy parchment envelope. The fractured pieces of the dark crimson wax seal clung to the paper, serving as a physical testament to the secrets hidden inside. I carefully extracted the legal document drafted by the Delaware firm. I centered it on the table, right next to the steel lockbox. "This is a superseding last will and testament," I declared, my voice ringing with clinical finality. "It was executed 6 months prior to Grandpa's passing. I suggest you read the primary penalty clause, Brent." Brent leaned over the polished wood. His eyes darted across the typed paragraphs. I watched the realization dawn on him. I witnessed the exact moment he understood the depth of his ruin. The clause clearly stipulated that any evidence of theft or manipulation instantly voided the initial distribution. It mandated the immediate transfer of all real estate holdings, liquid portfolios, and business assets to me. He recoiled from the table as if the parchment emitted physical heat. "You forged this!" he yelled, his vocal cords fracturing, resulting in a high, weak pitch. "You typed this up in your apartment. It is a fake. You are trying to steal my inheritance out of spite." Marcus Thorne finally spoke. His voice was a low, lethal drawl, cutting through the frantic noise of my brother's panic. "My paralegals filed the authenticated originals with the state probate court yesterday morning," Mr. Bailey Thorne stated. "The presiding judge reviewed the out-of-state notary seals and the accompanying forensic audit. He found the evidence compelling enough to issue an immediate emergency freeze on every asset you currently possess. You do not have an inheritance. You are legally occupying property that belongs to my client." The revelation struck the room with devastating force. The curated illusion of the Bailey family dynasty shattered into irreparable fragments. Jessica pushed her chair back. The wooden legs scraped harshly against the carpet, creating a terrible screeching sound. She stood up, clutching her generic canvas tote bag against her chest like a shield. She looked at the man she had married, the man who had promised her endless coastal luxury and elite social standing. He was now a destitute suspect facing imminent federal indictment. Her self-preservation instincts engaged, overriding any lingering marital loyalty. "I did not know about the embezzlement," she stammered, her gaze darting between Thorne and the heavy oak door. "I thought the business was legitimate. I only processed the DMV form because he told me he owned the vehicle, and the paperwork was a formality." He lied to me, too. Brent reached toward her. "Jess, please," he begged, his tone pathetic and hollow. "Do not touch me," she hissed, recoiling from his outstretched hand. "I am calling a divorce lawyer. I will not let you drag me into federal court for your crimes." She turned on her heel and walked out of the conference room, the heavy door clicking shut behind her, echoing like a gavel strike. Susan remained seated, her posture crumbling inward. She stared at the forged motor vehicle release, the ledgers, and the bank affidavit. The willful ignorance she had maintained for years could no longer protect her. She had coddled a predator. She had signed a fraudulent mortgage document believing his lies over her daughter's warnings. She realized her complicity had not saved her son. It had merely provided him the ammunition to destroy her financial security. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. Brent sat alone at the long table. The allies he had relied upon to validate his existence had abandoned him. He was a hollow shell, surrounded by a staggering landscape of printed evidence. He could not yell his way out of the math. He could not charm his way past the digital IP traces. His bespoke suit, his luxury cars, his loud, dominating presence meant nothing in the face of the data. He was dismantled. I looked at the rusted steel lockbox resting on the mahogany surface. I looked at the man who had mocked me for inheriting a piece of junk. I reached forward and gathered the printed pages. I stacked the ledgers, the bonds, the affidavits, and the superseding will into a neat, orderly pile. I placed the stack back into my portfolio. I snapped the metal ring shut and closed the heavy leather cover. The sound was sharp and decisive, closing the final chapter of his reign. I stood up from the head of the table, adjusting the strap of my satchel over my shoulder. I looked down at my brother, noting the raw terror swimming in his eyes. "I suggest you find a very good federal defense attorney," I said. I walked out of the mahogany-paneled law office and stepped into the crisp coastal afternoon. The sky above Portland was a brilliant, hard blue. The Atlantic wind carried the scent of salt and frozen pine. I did not feel a sudden rush of euphoria. I did not feel the cinematic thrill of a dramatic victory. People often mistake justice for a sudden, loud event. They expect screaming matches and shattered glass. But true retaliation is a quiet, systemic process. Revenge is not loud. It is a forensic audit. It is a court docket. It is the slow, unyielding pressure of undeniable data crushing a false narrative into dust. The referral packet Marcus Thorne sent to the state attorney general functioned exactly like a controlled demolition. The Cybercrimes Division executed search warrants on Jessica's former real estate brokerage, seizing server hard drives and internal communication logs. They traced the forged motor vehicle release directly to a specific terminal, verifying the exact timestamp. From there, the federal prosecutors unspooled the rest of the thread. They subpoenaed the banking records, subpoenaed the shell company tax filings, and interviewed the retired regional bank manager who had signed the sworn confession. The paper trail was a sheer vertical cliff, and my brother was in freefall. Brent was formally indicted on multiple federal counts, including wire fraud, bank fraud, and aggravated identity theft. His high-priced defense attorneys from the Sterling firm abandoned him the moment the probate court froze his liquid assets. You cannot retain elite legal counsel with empty bank accounts and a shattered reputation. He was assigned a public defender, a weary, overworked lawyer who looked at the mountain of chronological ledgers, the offshore bearer bonds, and the IP traces, and advised his client to surrender. Brent took the plea deal. To avoid a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary, he agreed to full asset forfeiture. He signed away his legal rights to the imported luxury vehicles, the designer watches, the coastal flip properties, and every remaining dollar in his dummy corporate accounts. He surrendered everything back to the estate trust. I stood in the back of the federal courtroom on the day the judge finalized the agreement. Brent wore a wrinkled, off-the-rack suit. His shoulders were stooped. He looked 10 years older, his face drawn and lined with exhaustion. He walked out of the courthouse doors holding a small cardboard box containing his personal paperwork. He was 36 years old, and he was completely destitute. The fallout extended to the edges of his former life. Jessica finalized her divorce proceedings within 3 months. She filed for bankruptcy, liquidated her remaining personal jewelry, and moved out of state. I heard she changed her surname and secured a low-level administrative job in a commercial property firm somewhere in the Midwest, trying to outrun the toxic stigma attached to the Bailey name. With the assets formally returned to my control under the authority of the superseding will, I had one final familial obligation to execute. I requested a certified bank draft drawn from the recovered offshore accounts. I drove to the quiet suburban neighborhood north of the city. I parked in the driveway of the white clapboard house with the dark green shutters. I unlocked the front door and walked into the kitchen. Susan was sitting at the granite island, staring at a cold cup of tea. The house felt vast and empty, lacking the frantic energy Brent used to bring into the space. I placed the certified bank draft on the polished stone counter. The numeric value printed on the paper matched the exact sum of the commercial bridge loan Brent had secured using her forged signature. "This clears the lien on the house," I said, keeping my voice level and professional.
You own the property free and clear. The bank will mail you the formal release of deed next week.
Susan looked at the bank draft and then up at me. Her eyes were rimmed with red. She reached out a trembling hand as if to touch my arm, but she stopped halfway, letting her hand fall back to her lap. "Thank you, Kiva," she whispered, her voice fragile. "I know I do not deserve this. I know what I did. I did not offer her absolution. I did not step around the island to embrace her. The biological tie remained, but the trust was permanently broken. I secured your roof because Grandpa Henry would not want his daughter living on the street," I replied. "But you made your choice, Mom. You chose the illusion over the truth." I turned and walked out of the house. We have not shared a meal since that day. We exchange brief, obligatory text messages on major holidays. She lives in a pristine, quiet house, surrounded by the memories of the golden boy she tried to protect, while I live in the reality I fought to secure. The boundary is drawn, and the perimeter is secure. The ultimate poetic justice did not manifest in a courtroom. It arrived 6 months later on the asphalt staging lanes of the Maritime Shipping Terminal. The logistics firm promoted me to Senior Logistics Director. I moved into a corner office featuring a floor-to-ceiling glass wall overlooking the sprawling industrial freight yard. I controlled the inbound manifests, the outbound trucking routes, and the hiring protocols for the heavy machinery operators. We experienced a labor shortage during the harsh winter months, requiring a new influx of dock workers. The Human Resources Department forwarded a batch of cleared applications to my terminal for final approval. I scrolled through the digital personnel files. I stopped on a specific background check. The applicant possessed 0 maritime experience, but indicated a desperate willingness to work the night shifts and the heavy weather rotations. The name on the file was Brent Bailey. I did not reject the application. I approved the hire. On a rainy Tuesday morning, I stood by the glass wall of my office, holding a cup of black coffee. Down in the damp gray staging yard, the new rotation of dock workers gathered around the equipment shed. Among them, wearing a high-visibility neon yellow safety vest, a hard hat, and steel-toed boots, was my brother. He held a clipboard in his calloused hands. His designer wool coats were gone, replaced by heavy insulated canvas. He walked toward a massive yellow industrial forklift. Before he climbed into the metal cage, he paused. He turned his head and looked up at the administrative building. His eyes found the corner office. He saw me standing behind the glass looking down at the yard. He did not scowl. He did not yell. He simply broke eye contact, lowered his head, and punched his paper time card into the mechanical clock. The sharp, heavy click echoed across the wet pavement. He climbed into the operator's seat and engaged the diesel engine. The man who had mocked me for taking the unglamorous tasks now clocks in under my direct management every single day. He moves the freight I tell him to move. The hierarchy has corrected itself. The system has achieved balance. As for the 1978 Ford pickup, it never saw the inside of a scrap crusher. I paid the storage fees and moved the truck out of the shipping container back to Dave's auto and diesel garage. Dave and I spent the entire winter working on the vehicle. We pulled the heavy engine block using a chain hoist. We machined the scored cylinders, replaced the corroded alternator, installed fresh serpentine belts, and flushed the transmission lines. We scrubbed the grease from the firewall, but I instructed Dave to leave the matte black steel lockbox welded exactly where Henry had placed it. It sits empty now, serving as a permanent structural monument to the man who engineered my survival. When we finally finished the restoration, I climbed into the cab. The interior smelled of fresh leather cleaner and new motor oil. I reached for the ignition. I turned the rusted key. The engine caught instantly. There was no hesitation. There was no metallic knocking. The pistons fired in perfect synchronized rhythm. It was a low, steady, powerful hum. Grandpa was right. A good engine runs quiet. I used a portion of the recovered offshore funds to establish a permanent endowment. I coordinated with local community colleges to launch the Henry Bailey Financial Literacy Scholarship. The program provides full tuition for young women from blue-collar backgrounds, teaching them how to read corporate ledgers, audit supply chains, and protect their personal assets. We train them to spot the anomalies in the math. We teach them how to identify the leaks in the hull before the ship sinks. That is the end of the logbook. A rusted pickup truck, a forged signature, and a grandfather who knew the value of a quiet, reliable foundation. If your family has ever mistaken your quietness for weakness, you understand this story. If they have ever laughed at you for taking the unglamorous jobs or expected you to absorb their failures just to keep the peace, do not raise your voice. Do not engage in the shouting matches. The loudest people in the room are always the ones trying to distract you from the truth. They project noise to hide their rusted components. Let them yell. Let them perform for the crowd. Every lie they tell, every fraudulent move they make leaves a physical trace. Gather the receipts, cross-reference the data, build your binder, and keep it secured. When the time comes, you will not need to scream to be heard. You just slide the paper across the table and let the truth do the shouting. If you know someone who is currently carrying the weight of a loud, arrogant family, send them this video. Remind them that the game is not over until the final audit is filed. Subscribe to the channel, drop a comment below, sharing your own story of taking back the board, and I will see you in the next one.